A 21-year-old woman is accused of brutally killing a 41-year-old man, possibly with a metal hammer. But police say they found a chilling note on his chest. Pedo touches children. Was this a cold-blooded murder or something much more complicated? Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. 21-year-old Journee McGrew is accused of murdering 41-year-old Waduta Woodley, that she allegedly bludgeoned him to death. In fact, with an autopsy reportedly concluding there were several chop injuries. News 4 Jax reporting blunt force trauma injuries to the head and face. But here's the thing. Apparently, authorities found a note on Woodley's chest that said, "Pedo touches children," and that it was written in a green highlighter, which is important. We'll talk about in a minute. But you see, according to True Crime News, McGrew had accused Woodley of grooming her since she was a minor, which, by the way, raises a lot of interesting legal questions and potentially a legal defense. So according to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, quoted around 3:30 a.m., Wednesday, July 2nd, 2025, Jacksonville Sheriff's Office patrol officers responded to a dispute on Manotech Avenue on the west side. When officers arrived, they found an adult male suffering from multiple blunt force injuries. Jacksonville Fire and Rescue Department personnel arrived, but the victim passed away. Then it goes on to say how JSO homicide and crime scene unit detectives, along with the state attorney's office, began investigating immediately. After reviewing evidence and interviewing witnesses, detectives identified, and then they say, McGrew as the suspect. And officers arrested McGrew later that day, booked her into the John E. Good pretrial detention facility for second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. We're going to break down the case. We're going to break down the investigation. Let me bring in right now Florida criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Kathleen Bogenschutz. Kathleen, thank you so much for taking the time. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I want to first start with the attack and the crime scene. Okay, you're talking multiple injuries. Woodley found dead reportedly in the breezeway of McGrew's apartment complex, so apparently behind a stairwell. A lot of blood under his body. Also blood on the walls and ground outside of the residence. True Crime News reporting that the sheriff's office indicated there were blood-soaked footprints from the doorway to the bathroom of the home. And then they find this bloody metal hammer in the bathroom sink. More specifically, blood on the handle. Okay, from all of that alone, before we go any further, what do you take away from a prosecutorial point of view and also maybe from a defense point of view?
Prosecutorial point of view, sounds like this was a sustained beating. Sounds like this was something done in anger. And, you can hear that on a TV show, but if you really put yourself in the position of the assailant continuing to hit somebody with a hammer who's fighting back, it really does take quite a bit out of you. And I guess the medical examiner will be able to tell us how many times he was actually struck, or at least give us a range of the number of times he was actually struck. That being said, we also have the blood evidence. It's said covered in blood. I get the feeling we probably have some spatter and some cast off evidence. So once the first blow is landed and the person is bleeding, as the assailant brings the weapon back, it has blood on it, so it will cast off some spray onto the walls. And you're able to, as a forensic examiner, as a crime scene person, measure that and try to figure out, how many times somebody was struck, what was the speed of the instrument, and what that instrument might be. Now, we found the hammer, so that's not really an issue in this case.
And from a defense point of view, I wonder, do they say, I wonder if it goes into testing. How do they test for, what is the testing done for this biological fluid, for this, the blood? What is the testing that's done for this crime scene? And is that something the defense can use to their advantage in some sort of way?
Sure. So there's a liquid called luminol that is used in crime scenes. Usually it's sprayed on things to try to figure out if blood used to be on the surface, or if very minute particles of blood, like little pinpricks of cast off, maybe from something like this or from the top of the weapon, landed somewhere. And if it lands on a dark surface, sometimes it's very difficult to see. And luminol, the name kind of gives you a hint, but it glows in the dark. So that's something that they will do sometimes to try to determine whether somebody's cleaned up the scene, and to try to see if there's maybe some other blood matter that's microscopic that they can test. So a lot of times the assailant will, it's difficult to kill another human being with blunt force trauma. I'm not suggesting anybody give it a shot, but um, the fact is that it's highly usual for somebody in a stabbing or in a one of these blunt force cases to maybe injure themselves in the process, and there may be some blood or some other tissue from the assailant that's mixed in there too that you could do DNA testing on.
By the way, I know this is off topic, but I just have to say it. Debt, okay? Debt doesn't just show up one day. It builds little by little. Credit cards, car loans, medical bills. Suddenly you're juggling all these payments. You're feeling stuck, but here's the good news. You just need American Financing, our sponsor. You need a reset. They help homeowners like you every day. They use your home's equity and they roll that high interest debt into one simple, affordable payment. So they're saving homeowners an average of $800 a month. There's no judgment, there's no pressure, just real solutions that put you back in control. Imagine breathing again, sleeping again, knowing your future is yours to shape. It starts with one phone call. Only takes 10 minutes to get started. And there are no upfront fees, so it costs you nothing to find out how much you can save. And by the way, if you start today, you may be able to delay your next 2 mortgage payments. American Financing, salary-based consultants, they're ready to listen, they're ready to help. Take back your peace of mind with American Financing. Call American Financing today at 866-891-2821. That's 866-891-2821, or go to americanfinancing.net/sidebar. And going back to the defense here, I think it's impossible, it seems from my point of view, before we even get into what she allegedly said to police, it seems impossible she's going to deny saying someone else did this. I mean, you have
Right.
all the evidence leading back to her, the physical evidence. It does become a question about what that evidence says about the attack. And I wonder from a defense point of view, again, we'll get into what a potential defense could be if these allegations can be proven that she was somehow abused, put that to the side. Do they try to say it's not, like something you said hit me, that it's not as bloody as it's made to seem, that this was more deliberate strokes meant to defend oneself, that it wasn't just a brutal, macabre scene where blood everywhere and it was a savage attack? Do they try to limit how much blood was actually found? Am I stretching here?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that they could go for is to try to examine the footprints to try to figure out what the exact series of events were. So we've got allegedly a female assailant here and a male victim in this homicide. Generally speaking, women have smaller feet, smaller shoes. If she was wearing shoes, and there should be some ability to try to determine whose footprints were whose. It's also possible that the victim was stumbling around quite a bit. The other thing that we can look at is, I mean, like I said, this is a kind of a heat of passion kind of crime that you have to really get yourself fairly worked up to beat somebody like with a hammer to death. And so while the prosecution can say, this indicates like a real serious anger, a real serious intent to kill, when you realize the note that was found on the body, I'm not saying that it's true, but you can connect that to the amount of anger that you can see in the offense. There's plenty of people who think that pedophilia or preying upon children is worse than a murder.
By the way, News4Jax reported that the drain plug for the sink in the bathroom was actually found in McGrew's bedroom, and there was blood on it. Is that important for the tampering with evidence charge? I mean, what do you take away from that?
Well, I mean, it's potentially cleaning up the scene afterward. Um, uh, you'll oftentimes see crime scene units taking apart like the undercarriages of sinks. That the tubing underneath there to get to the point where there's the kink in the sink where you would find, like, if you dropped your ring down the sink, where you might be able to undo the sink and remove that heavier item. So a lot of times there's information in there that can be found. I mean, the cleanup, if she's leaving a note like that on the body, the cleanup is potentially very interesting to me, because what is she trying to hide if she's admitting to doing this and putting a note on the body? So
Yeah.
like I said, we don't have any proof that, and I don't want to claim that we know that there's some truth to the note here. Back when I was a prosecutor, we used to say, I don't care what he did, essentially what your mom used to tell you when you were a kid. Two wrongs don't make a right. We don't sentence people to death on the spot for doing this. It's a little bit different now because I don't know how young she would claim to be when victimized, but in the state of Florida, we brought back the death penalty for capital sexual battery, which is sex bad on a child under the age of 12. Hasn't been tested at the appellate court yet. It was held unconstitutional about, I don't know, 20 or so years ago with the US Supreme Court case. But you really don't have that argument anymore in the state of Florida that, like, well, you don't get the death sentence for potentially having these predilections. And the answer is, yeah, in theory, Florida could sentence you to death, but not without due process of law, not without discovery, not without a defense attorney, and not without multiple rounds of appeal.
By the way, real quick, as we're talking about this, are domestic violence attacks usually particularly heinous? Is there a reason for that? Did you see that in your profession?
Yes, a lot of times. So there's two things. Number one, there's usually a lot of anger. It's something pent up. It's probably something this person's been thinking about for a while, especially if they live together and there's that resentment brewing. But there's also the fact that a lot of times it's really not planned. And it's somebody who just snaps. So you're dealing with whatever, I hate to put it this way, but whatever instruments you have on hand, and a lot of times those are knives or hammers or scissors or something like that, in order to attack somebody, something that you can grab quickly. And I'm not saying that everybody keeps their guns locked up the way that they should, but the thing that you can get your hands on the quickest is probably like a knife block in the kitchen, if you think about it.
No, it's a good point. News4Jax also reported, by the way, there were other pieces of evidence that were collected by police. So you have a pair of Crocs that were apparently covered in blood, a tank top, pants also covered in blood, and they also apparently found a notebook with loose paper, and you guessed it, a green highlighter. So Kathleen, as we were talking about, the evidence is going to establish it is very difficult for her to say someone else did this, and this just adds to that, right? I mean,
Yeah,
in terms of writing the note.
correct. And this is, again, and I harp on this all the time now that I do criminal defense. A lot of criminal defense is sitting down with your client and having really serious discussions about what the evidence is, what it shows, and what arguments we can make with a straight face about the evidence, that we don't want to lose credibility here. So in this situation, I mean, I don't have all the discovery, but I would imagine that you would be looking at some kind of a diminished capacity defense. I will note she's charged with murder too. I don't
Yeah,
know
I was going
if
to
that's
ask you that. What is that? What is second-degree murder under Florida law?
it's basically a heat of passion thing. So you meant to kill the person, but there really wasn't time for reflection. And the classic example that we give to law students and to lay people is you come home, you find your wife in bed with another man, and you just act without thinking about it, and one or both ends up dead. So it's like a real sudden heat of passion type thing. In this scenario, I don't know if the facts will bear that out, but I will note that in Florida, the only way you can get to a first degree murder is by indictment, by grand jury. So most of the time, when you see a homicide case, you will see somebody who's going to be charged with murder one, or we think they're going to be charged with murder one, be arrested on murder two, held without bond. And then once the state kind of gets I mean, I don't want to say get their act together, but they've got to get their witnesses together. They got to
Sure,
get
sure.
EMTs and cops and civilian witnesses, and everybody comes into the grand jury. They take testimony and they get an indictment. So it's not unusual to see murder two. My question here is whether that stays put or if we
Point.
upgrade it to a murder one.
To see if they can prove premeditation, and which is interesting,
Right.
right? That would be the
To
essential.
see if they think they can prove premeditation anyway.
Which I want to get into in a second, but assuming for a moment that they stick with second-degree murder and they don't go murder one, either they don't get a grand jury to move forward with murder one, or they just decide not to present evidence of murder one to a grand jury. If they stick with second-degree murder, that tells you something about their views on the case. And two, what's the potential punishment for second-degree murder?
So second degree murder with a weapon, which obviously we have here, is up to a life sentence. Florida has a 10/20 life law that you'll often hear. There's minimum mandatories in Florida, but that's only if a gun is used. So if in this scenario, you wouldn't be looking at a minimum mandatory, you'd be looking at a score sheet, and then you'd be looking at the weapon enhancement. So the possibility is for life no matter what. And in Florida, as I often repeat myself, life is life. You come out in a box. We did away with parole, excuse me, back in the late 90s. So if you hear of somebody getting paroled in Florida, it's a very, very old offense.
Mm. So it's either, so how would it work? There's a possibility she could get, I don't know, 15 years, 20 years. There is a range here about what she could get, and she would have to serve that full time.
Right. And potentially, depending on what the state of the law is. Now, there was just a law passed in Florida reducing the amount of time you would have to serve on a sentence. So July 1st on certain enumerated offenses. So it's not sex crimes. We've never done gain time and good time for those, but that it dropped your average or the time that you would do from 85% to 72%. And that's actually a fairly significant reduction
It is.
for most people that are in custody. But that's of July 1st, 2025. So, and for non-sex offenses, I can tell you that off the bat. But the other thing is that there may be quite a bit of discretion that the prosecutor could have. I remember a case that we had in Fort Lauderdale. Thankfully, it wasn't mine. But it was there was a gentleman who had caught somebody molesting his son, and basically the whole homicide unit said not it. Where there was evidence, and the child would testify, and I think the guy may have already been a convicted sex offender. But it was a real, like,
Right.
we have to hold this guy responsible for what he did, but does anybody really want to get involved in this? So
Well,
it ended up being a very short sentence.
that brings us to this. This
Right.
is the central question in this case, because I want to get into what the defendant apparently said. So now we've established the evidence is probably pretty strong she did it. What's the defense? So apparently this is what she said. News4Jax reporting that officers, when they responded, they told her to come out. She did, and then she asked if Woodley was still alive. Okay. She then apparently decided to provide statements to police, and she reportedly accused Woodley of sexually grooming her since she was 8 years old and proceeded to sexually assault her. Now, to be clear, at the time of this recording, there has been no independent verification of these allegations. We simply don't know if any of this is true. However, she apparently claims that on July 1st, she texted Woodley that she was fantasizing about him. Now, and apologized for treating him badly and invited him over. However, she claims that by 1 a.m., Woodley was pressuring her into having sex, and this is apparently after the both of them had been drinking. She says she refused, asked him to leave her place, but as they were leaving, she allegedly picks up that metal hammer and hides it behind her back. Remember where he was found, right? Not necessarily in the apartment, but outside. And she claims they get to the front door. He grabs her. However, reportedly, she acknowledges that he didn't really use a lot of force when he grabbed her, or allegedly grabbed her. And that is when she used the hammer to strike him. Now, this is interesting. Police asked her if her plan was to invite him over with the intent to kill, right? We're talking potentially first-degree murder. And apparently, her response was redacted. Let's start there. Kathleen, is her statement redacted because it was an alleged confession?
Yeah. So there's 119 is our public records laws in Florida, and any information about a confession would be redacted. There's other subsections there that would also make sense. You redact the name of the victim of a sex crime, and you also maybe don't release the photos of a dead body at a homicide scene. But yes, confessions is one of the things that would be redacted, just to not poison the public for purposes of a jury trial.
I think we can all agree why these statements would be helpful to the prosecution. But let's talk about the defense here. A, is there any way they can keep these statements out from a trial? And B, if they can't, does this help in any sort of legal defense? If this is, and I guess the follow-up question is, she'd have to prove that she was abused, right?
Yes, she would, but we've seen in the past, well, I'm dating myself now. So I would say the past 20 to 25 years, there's we've all heard of the battered spouse defense, where a spouse who's been horribly abused over the years suddenly kills their abuser after a period of time. Um, there's also been something called the battered child syndrome, which is similar, but it is and it's not necessarily your child, but a child in the household who reacts. She's not a juvenile, but I could see the defense trying to go toward kind of a battered child syndrome response, that there was this abuse over the years, assuming they can prove it. And I would assume she's going to have to testify to what kind of abuse she suffered over the years if they want to use this kind of a defense, because somebody's going to need to give them a good faith basis to be able to go forward on this. But over the years, all this levels of sexual abuse, it could form the basis for a significantly diminished jury finding, or even a jury nullification, or what we might know as a jury pardon in this case. I'll also note that if there was this one child that he started on when she was 8, the likelihood is there may be other victims out there, and I'm curious to see if anyone else kind of pops up and self-identifies too.
I'll ask you in a second about whether or not the judge will allow this to be researched and investigated. Put that to the side. If this is allowed, you're saying these defenses, could she be found not guilty, or would her punishment be reduced or the charge reduced?
A jury could find that she was justified, or that she did not have the mens rea, or she was acting at such a diminished capacity based on her past abuse, that in theory they could find her not guilty. I don't know if that's going to happen. Most juries will split the baby in these kinds of cases, unless there's really strong evidence that goes one way or the other. But the fact she left a note at the crime scene, I mean, that kind of started the wheels in motion for a defense. And I will note that the flip side of this is we don't know if any of this is true. And if
Yeah.
you're the prosecutor on this case, like you're potentially looking at it and saying, well, wasn't it enough to kill him? And then you had to destroy his reputation posthumously as well. So I don't know if that's the tack they're going to take. I think it'll depend on if other evidence comes out.
And look, it doesn't help her case necessarily that it looks like, I mean, she allegedly invited him over and then this happened. I will say, News4Jax reported they did a criminal background check on Woodley. There was no reported criminal charges regarding sexual abuse or assault of minors. However, you and I both know that doesn't mean
Yeah,
that the
right.
claims are false. Doesn't mean that the
Right.
claims are false. It could have happened. He just was never charged. You think a judge is going to allow the defense to explore this and investigate this? And like you said, maybe see if there were other people who were allegedly victimized by this man? I mean, because at this point, these allegations, there's no way to verify them. Or that hasn't been
Well,
verified, I should say.
yeah, there's no way to verify them that we're aware of at this point in time. I'm assuming that we're going to download everybody's phones, everybody's computers, and once that starts happening, there might be some more information that's out there about past victims, or the lack thereof, victims of this kind of offense. And I'm certain that, like, for example, I've had an iPhone since 2008. So in theory, you could go back into my iCloud account and get my messages from 2008. And she's only 21. So I wonder what kind of messages were passing between them over the years. At least since the advent of text messaging, which I think was around 2005, 2006. So that's fairly, I mean, you may have a fairly decent digital trail from which you could say, yes, this is consistent with some kind of sexual abuse, or no, I don't even see any evidence of that. Um, which is, at least it's something that we have now that we used to not have back in the day.
So this all comes down, I think you're right, to potentially her testifying. I think that's going to be a big part of it. I will tell you, by the way, the News and Observer has reported Then an arrest report reveals McGrew allegedly reached out to her father's wife at 2 a.m. on July 2nd, and the father starts driving to McGrew's place, and as he's driving there, he speaks to her on the phone. Basically, she recounts what we described before, with her even allegedly saying, "I think he's dead, Daddy." And he apparently told her to call the police, and he ended up calling 911. Kathleen, that's an interesting factor to consider in this case.
Yeah, it is. For somebody's first thought to be to call the police versus to go over to their child's house when their child is telling them that somebody is deceased. I'm questioning whether there's maybe family members that could corroborate that there was some kind of sexual abuse, or even friends that could say that, no, she didn't just come up with this story that he was sexually abusing her after she beat him to death with the hammer, that she told me about this when we were 15. She told me about this when we were 16. She told me about this when we were 20. And how long it was going on, things like that, maybe a friend or a counselor or something like that.
Right now, Miss McGrew is behind bars, no bond. Her next court date is set for July 24th, and we'll keep a careful eye on this one. Really sad case. Kathleen Bogenschutz, thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.